Hello and welcome. My name is Alana Weiss. I'm part of Google EDU, and today it is my honor to welcome Barry Schwartz to the Leading at Google series. Barry is a professor of psychology at Swarthmore College, and he's been teaching there since 1971 upon completion of his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of 10 books and hundreds of articles, and he's actually been to Google before, because in 2004, he published a book entitled Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. And his TED Talk on that book is actually how I learned of his work and became very excited. And he is here today to speak about his newest book, Practical Wisdom. Please join me in welcoming Barry. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's also, of course, a little intimidating, but I'll try to suppress my terror. I decided that what I would do is combine the stuff that I have already written about on choice very quickly, just in case there's somebody out here who doesn't already know something about it, but focus mostly on the new work on practical wisdom. So the title of the talk is Practical Wisdom, the Choices That Matter, because the book on choice was all about how when you give people too much choice, it leads to all kinds of bad results. And what I'm going to focus on today is how when you give people too little choice, it leads to all kinds of bad results. And in addition, the choice stuff is really, from my point of view, about how Google relates to the rest of the world, at least as far as you're concerned. It's really about what Google needs to do actually succeed in serving its clients and giving us, the rest of us, what we need. The practical wisdom is really much more about how Google works with Google. It's really about how organizations need to be structured and how they need to run in order to allow people to do their best work. So this is a more inward-looking, at least from my point of view, focus. Okay, so the official syllogism in the US and pretty much every other Western country runs roughly like this. We can't ever have too much freedom. The more freedom people have, the better off they are. We should take every opportunity to enhance freedom when we can. If we agree to that, and pretty much everyone does, the question is, how do you enhance freedom? And the answer is obvious. You can't enhance freedom without giving people choice. So more freedom means more well-being, and more choice means more freedom. And so it follows, as the night the day, that the more choice people have, the better off they are. This seems to me to be almost unassailable. It's logically powerful. The only trouble is that it is psychologically false. It ain't true. And the research that I and others have done in the last 10 or 15 years has shown that when people have too much choice, bad stuff happens. And again, I'm going to do this very fast. The first bad thing that happens is that people are paralyzed. With everything at their disposal, they can't pull the trigger. Instead of being liberated by all this choice, they're paralyzed by all this choice. The second bad thing that happens is if they overcome paralysis and choose, they are likely to choose badly. People make bad decisions even in simple environments. Well, you can just imagine how much worse the decisions are when the environments get complex. And let me assure you that choosing among 60 or 70 Medicare Part D prescription drug plans is complex enough to challenge anyone, even the people in this room, let alone their aging grandparents and parents. The third bad thing that happens is if you overcome paralysis and choose, and if you get lucky and you choose well, people end up less satisfied with good choices if they're chosen from large choice sets than if they're chosen from small ones. It is always easy to imagine when you encounter any imperfection in any item or activity that you have chosen, it is easy to imagine that some alternative out there would have been better. And so you compare how good the thing is with how good you expect it to be, and you end up disappointed. So psychologists have known for 40 or 50 years that choice is good, and yet my stuff has emphasized the ways in which choice is bad. So how can choice be good and bad? And the way I have conceptualized it is that the relation between the amount of choice people have and how they feel looks roughly like this curve. And just so that you're clear, the curve does not actually capture real data. It's an idealization. But the point is that all the way on the left, when people have no choice, life is infinitely bad. You can't live a human life and not have significant choice. However, as you add choice and you make life better and better and better, a point is reached where all of the benefits of choice essentially asymptote, flatten out, and all of the negative consequences of too much choice start to rear their ugly heads, and the curve changes direction. To be technical, the relation between choice and well-being is non-monotonic, and the task is to figure out the point in a choice space where people can derive all of the benefits without paying the substantial psychological cost. So, if the curve looks like I just described it to you, the question you face as a provider of options to people is, what's the right amount of choice? So one task that people face, whether it's supermarkets, clothing retailers, or information providers, is what's the sweet spot? How many options is the right amount of options for people to derive the benefits of having choice without paying the price? And the sad fact is that there is no algorithmic way to answer that question. I'm afraid the way you figure out what the sweet spot is by studying people making decisions in different domains. The sweet spot is likely to be different in different areas of life. Finding the sweet spot, however, is enormously important. The second thing you can do, and I think Google does this remarkably well, is you separate the principle from the agent. That is to say, you have an agent who curates the choice space. And even though there may be hundreds and hundreds of options, the principal, the person who's actually going to have to make the choice, only sees 3 or 4. And you have wisely structured the choice domain and filtered out options so that not only does the principal only see 3 or 4, but it's just the right 3 or 4. And it doesn't matter under those conditions how many options are out there, because the only ones that the principal sees are the ones that matter. And the last thing that you can do is pay attention to what economist Richard Thaler and law professor Cass Sunstein refer to as choice architecture. Pay attention to how options are structured so that you make it as easy as possible for people to choose at all and to choose well. And the most important characteristic of choice architecture is to pay attention to what happens when people do nothing. People do nothing a lot. They're busy, they're distracted, they're overwhelmed, they do nothing. In a study of organ donation, 90-something% of Americans approve of organ donation, 26% of Americans are organ donors. Right? 1/4 of the people in the United States who think organ donation is a good idea are actually organ donors. If you look in Europe, where they also use driver's license renewal as an opportunity to get organ donors, you see that there are many countries in Europe where virtually everyone is an organ donor, and there are a few that look like the United States. So what's the difference between the countries on the left and the countries on the right? The difference is the countries on the right, you are an organ donor unless you opt out. The countries on the left, like the United States, you are not an organ donor unless you opt in. Paying attention to what happens when people do nothing is a major, major opportunity to help people make good choices. The same thing has been shown with 401ks. The standard procedure with 401k participation is that you have to give your employer permission to withhold some money, and otherwise everything comes to you and there's no savings for retirement. If you switch the default so that money is automatically withheld from your paycheck unless you tell the employer not to, you triple the rate of 401k participation. So this is merely one example of how, rather than imposing solutions on people and eliminating choice, which would after all be un-American, you give people options, but you structure the options so that people are nudged in the direction that you have independent reason to believe is the direction that they would choose. And so, as a provider of, quote, all of the world's information, you have an enormous opportunity to do precisely this, basically with the results of every search anyone ever does. You nudge people in the right direction, make it hard for them to go in the wrong direction. People are nonetheless free to look at the 75,822nd ranked result of a Google search if they want to, but you're making it easy for them to look at the results that are most likely to be the results they care about, as long as you do it right. And there are millions of opportunities to make nudges like this. I just read a paper 3 days ago. We have an obesity problem in the United States. I assume you're all aware of it, although apparently there's no obesity problem at Google, despite the infinite availability of food. So it turns out that people are much more likely to choose items from the top of a menu list or the bottom of a menu list than they are items in the middle. You can't force people to eat healthy, but if you put all the really poisonous stuff in the middle of the menu, you will decrease the chances that people order it. There are nudges like this available almost everywhere you look, none of them depriving people of freedom of choice, all of them helping people to make better choices. So that was what the choice book was about, how we have too much choice and what we can do about it. Now I want to focus on my current work, which is about how we have too little choice. What prompted this book, and it's written with my colleague Ken Sharp, who teaches political science at Swarthmore. What prompted this book is a sense that Ken and I have had for quite some time that America is, in some important respects, broken. And what I mean by that is that our kids' teachers don't know our kids well enough, we think, to give each of them what they need. And they don't seem to care enough to find out what our kids need. Our doctors rush through office visits in 7 minutes, hardly having the opportunity to get to know us. And increasingly, at least I find this, our office visits to the doctor are mostly spent with you watching as the doctor stares at the laptop and enters data in response to the questions that you get asked. Lawyers pursue billable hours and seldom ask whether what we think we need and want is what we should need and want. And of course, the bankers. Bankers nearly wrecked the world economy, and it seems to me the jury is still out about whether the world economy will be saved. Nothing in America seems to work the way it should. Now, historically, when we encounter institutions that don't work well, don't give us what we need, don't give us what we want, we have two tools that we reach for to solve the problem. One tool is rules. More and more rules, more and more detailed rules, closer and closer regulation. The other tool is incentives. If we can find a way to create smart incentives so that people do well by doing good, the system will take care of itself. Some combination of rules and incentives is the magic solution to the problem of inadequate schools, overly expensive and inadequate health care, shyster lawyers, and corrupt, greedy bankers. If only we can find the right rules and the right incentives. The theme of our book is that neither rules nor incentives will get us what we need. They are blunt instruments, and in fact, they actually get in the way of getting us what we need. So, what we need is character, and in particular, we need an aspect of character that Aristotle called practical wisdom, and I'm going to try to explain to you very quickly what that is, and how every effort we currently make to make things better in our social institutions is actually making them worse. So let me talk to you about the janitor named Luke who works at a major medical center in the Midwest. These are the characteristic duties of hospital janitors in this particular medical center. Don't memorize them, there won't be an exam. But if you scan them, it should be clear that none of these things is the least bit surprising. They're just what you would imagine. Here are more of them. It may surprise you that there are so many items on the list, but not what the items are. So this is Luke and Luke's colleagues' job description. And yet, psychologists who interviewed Luke and his colleagues about their work and how they saw their work and what was important about their work would hear stories like the one that Luke told of how he had cleaned the room of a patient, young man who was comatose after a bar fight. And the young man's father was keeping a vigil. He was there in the hospital all day, every day. But he smoked, this guy, so he would occasionally go out to wherever he could smoke to have a cigarette. And so Luke cleaned this man's room, and the dad didn't see Luke clean this man's room. And he confronted Luke irate and demanded that he clean the room. And Luke, what did Luke do? Well, he said, I could have told him that I cleaned the room. I could have gotten angry because he was being so disrespectful. But you know, he was a man who was trying to do something, anything, to help his son. So I just cleaned the room again. Luke's interest was in serving the needs of the patient and the patient's family. None of that was in his job description. He did it effortlessly, he did it immediately, and it was things like that that made Luke eager to show up for work every day. It wasn't emptying trash cans, it was being part of the mission of easing suffering and providing comfort to people in distress. And Luke was not unique. There was another case of a guy who was sweeping washing the floor in the hallway, and a patient who had just recovered, had just been operated on, was slowly and with great difficulty getting out of bed to move a little bit up and down the hall to speed the healing, and he stopped washing the floor so that the patient could actually do this little bit of exercise without slipping and falling. There was another janitor, Charlene, who was told she had to clean the visitors' lounge, and she went to the lounge and noticed that there were 4 or 5 people, members of the same family, who were there again day after day and night after night, and they happened to be napping, and so she refrained from cleaning the visitors' lounge so that she wouldn't disturb them, even brooking disapproval from her supervisor. So these are the characteristics of janitors and their work that they regard as most important, even though there is not a single item on their list of duties that even mentions another human being. They are crafting their work so as to contribute to the mission of the hospital. And they are doing it wisely. Obviously, there are times when patients want them to do something where they have to back away because it requires a kind of expertise that they don't have. They need to know when to go forward and when to back off. And they learn how to do this by basically having lots of experience working with and around sick people. The second example is of a judge. Judge Lois Forer, and she was a judge in the Common Pleas Court in Philadelphia, and she reports the case of a young man named Michael who committed an armed robbery. He had just lost his job. He had a wife and a 6-year-old child who, with great difficulty, they were managing to send to a parochial school. And he had just lost his job. He had a little bit too much to drink. He was feeling desperate. He got into a taxi, and he held up the taxi driver with a toy gun. He got $50. He was caught. There was no question of his guilt. And the question that Forer faced is, what should the sentence be? There is a sentence for committing armed robbery in a public conveyance of 5 years in prison. That's what she could have sentenced him to. She thought that was preposterous. He had no criminal history. He was acting in a state of desperation. He seemed to be a dedicated family person. And so she sentenced him to 11 months in jail with release every day to go to work. So he got up, went to work, spent the day in the workplace, came back and slept in jail. After 11 months, he was released on probation. Went back to his family, got another job, family stayed united, everything seemed to be fine, except that the prosecutor couldn't live with that incredibly lenient sentence and appealed the sentence. And after the wheels of justice ground as slowly as they do, the prosecutor won the appeal, and Michael was required to serve out the remaining 4 years and 1 month of his sentence. Michael disappeared, and Lois Forer quit. She couldn't be a judge when being a judge meant that you couldn't use your judgment. And so what Lois Forer was trying to do was be a wise judge. What Luke and his colleagues in the hospital were trying to do is to be wise custodians. And what it means to be wise, from Aristotle's point of view, is to combine two things. One is the will to do the right thing, to provide what people need, which of course depends on what domain you're operating in. The other is to have the skill to figure out what the right thing is. And that takes skill because there's no formula to tell Lois Forer what the right sentence is in any given case. And there's no formula to tell the custodians how to intervene on behalf of patients. Wise people know when and how to make the exception to every rule. Wise people know when and how to improvise. We talk about wisdom as a kind of moral jazz. There are notes on the page, if you like. Those are the rules, but they're just guidelines. And what makes great jazz is not that you play the notes on the page, it's how you deviate from the notes on the page. You can do that well, or you can do that badly. Wise people are good jazz musicians. Wise people know how to find the mean, which is not the arithmetic average. It's what Aristotle had in mind when he talked about how courage was the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Now, where is the mean between cowardice and recklessness? The answer is it depends. It depends on the context, depends on the circumstances. There is no formulaic way to figure out what the mean is. Wise people know how to choose among virtues when they conflict. Imagine a doctor who believes that doctors should be honest with patients. Who doesn't believe that? The doctor also believes that doctors should be kind with patients. Well, it turns out that sometimes being honest tells you to do one thing and being kind tells you to do another. How do you balance two legitimate, important, but conflicting aspirations, conflicting values? Wise people figure out how to do it, and the point of balance, again, as Aristotle emphasized, depends on who you're dealing with, what the circumstances are. Wise people know how to put themselves in other people's places. They can see the world as other people see the world, and they can feel what other people are feeling. Empathic understanding is an essential ingredient of wisdom. It's something that takes experience to learn. Little kids have the impulse to be empathetic, but they don't have a clue about what would actually help. There's this great story about 2-year-olds in nursery school, and one of their classmates is upset and crying, and it bothers them, so they want to help this unhappy 2-year-old. So the question is, what should they do? And the answer they come up with is this: when I'm unhappy, I want a hug from my mom. And so they walk over to this unhappy 2-year-old, take her hand, and walk her over to their mom. A hug from my mom makes me feel better. Huh? Would you mute whatever that is? Is this the giant game or something? No. Thank you. Right? A hug from my mom makes me feel better when I'm unhappy, so a hug from my mom will make anyone feel better when they're unhappy. They have the impulse to ease the suffering of others, but they don't have a clue about what it takes to do that. Most of us, arguably, are a little better than 2-year-olds, but it takes experience really to get good at that. And perhaps most important, a wise person uses these skills in pursuit of the right aims, to serve other people and not to serve him or herself. If you use all of these skills to serve yourself, you become a Machiavellian manipulator, and that's not what Aristotle thought a virtuous person was like. And last, a wise person is made, not born. We argue in the book that everybody has the capacity to develop these characteristics, but it takes experience. It takes trial and error. It takes making mistakes and getting wiser as a result of learning from your mistakes. Nobody's born with the magic gift of wisdom. So, the wise doctor balances honesty, kindness, paternalism, and patient autonomy. Let me tell you what to do, you decide what to do. A wise lawyer balances passionate advocacy and judicious counsel. A wise teacher or parent balances the fairness with giving each child what she needs. That is to say, treating kids differently. And the question is, what does the wise Googler do? I hope, if there's time for some questions, you'll contribute to the answer to that question. I have a few suggestions, but I'm not going to give them to you yet, because otherwise you'll just leave. So, the argument in the book is that there is no substitute for wisdom, for the will to do the right thing and the skill to figure out what that is. Nonetheless, what we are doing in American society is engaging in a war on wisdom without realizing that we're doing it. And we're engaging in the war both on the development of skill and the development of will. What rules do, rigid scripts do, is they prevent people from improvising. They prevent people from engaging in trial and error, making mistakes, and getting better. You follow the script that some person smarter than you has handed you. And the result is that you never get any wiser after 10 years than you were on your first day. I can give you a great example of this. This is the lemonade story about a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan who took his son to a Detroit Tigers game. This boy was 7 years old, and he wanted some lemonade. So Dad got up to the concession stand to buy his son some lemonade. All they had was Mike's Hard Lemonade. Dad had no idea what that was, and so he bought it and he brought it back. And there was this kid drinking out of a bottle of Mike's Hard Lemonade. A security guard saw it and immediately called the police and an emergency ambulance team. They rushed to the stadium, got the boy, whisked him off to the hospital, checked him out. It turned out he was fine. His blood alcohol level was negligible. They were all set to release the child, and the welfare officers who were also summoned to the scene said, "Not so fast. What we have here is a case of child abuse. We will not allow the child to go back to the home." And so they put the child in a foster home. A week or so later, the case came before, and the welfare workers said, "We hate to do it, but we have to follow procedure." A week later, the case came before a magistrate who said, "Well, here's what I'll do. I'll let the boy go home, but only if Dad leaves the house and checks into a hotel. I hate to do it, but we have to follow procedure." After 3 weeks, I'm happy to say, the family was reunited, and for all I know, this 7-year-old kid now works here. The point, though, is that every step along the way, from the police to the child welfare agency to the judge, the answer to the question was always the same. I hate to do it, parentheses, I know this is stupid, close parentheses, but we have to follow procedure. Judge Forer, as I said, was required to follow procedure and change Michael's sentence, and the result she found so intolerable that she quit. And then there's education. If we think we don't have teachers who are smart enough to figure out how to teach, what we do is we give them scripts so that they don't have to figure out how to teach. And here's an example from a Chicago kindergarten. Every kindergarten teacher in the city of Chicago was doing exactly the same thing on day 53. Reading and enjoying literature, words with B, the bath. This is instructions to the teacher. The instructions are 20 pages long. The book is 30 pages long. Assemble students on the rug or reading area. Give students a warning about the dangers of hot water. Say, quote, "Listen very quietly as I read the story." Say, "Think of other pictures that make the same sound as the sound bath begins with." And so we routinize procedure that people follow so as to protect students or patients from disaster. But when we do that, we virtually guarantee that all they're going to get at best is mediocrity. There is no script that's the right script for every kid. When you give teachers a script, you are guaranteeing that you will misfit many of the students that the script is being used on. In addition, you deprive teachers of the opportunity actually to become teachers. They never get better at what they do because they don't have the room, the space, to learn what works and what doesn't work. And this is what we have done increasingly and what we have appealed to try to fix all the institutions that seem to be falling short. So if you're not going to just rely on rules, how about if we create smart incentives? Make it worthwhile for teachers to improve test scores. You know, the higher kids' test scores get, the better the teachers' salaries are. They get bonuses. They get all kinds of other perks. Let's make it worth their while, and then they'll work their asses off to get the kids to do better on tests. Some of you may have read the recent scandal in Georgia public schools. The teachers seem to have discovered, and principals have discovered, one way to enable kids to do better on standardized tests, and that is by changing the kids' answers. Massive, massive cheating scandal in Georgia public schools. So far, at least 175 teachers have been implicated. So this is not about a bad apple. This is about a very rotten barrel. And one of the things that produces this rotten barrel is the incentive structure that currently operates in education. I'll give you one example of this because I love it so much. And it concerns a daycare center in Israel that was being troubled because parents were coming late to pick up their kids. They just couldn't tear themselves away from the incredibly interesting work they were doing. So, you know, there was a temptation. You exhort the parents, come on time. It's disrespectful. They were still coming late. There's a temptation to close the center up and just leave kids sitting on the street. But somehow the director thought that that was inhumane. And so he figured the only way to get these people to show up when they should is to make it cost them to come late. So he introduced fines, lateness fines. They were roughly the equivalent of a parking ticket. And guess what happened when parents were fined for coming late? They didn't get angry. More people came late. Not because it was a price. You said it was a fine. I think it's a price. It's a price worth paying. Is it worth $15 for me to spend another half hour in the office? Damn right it is. And so month after month went by with these fines in place, and the curve of lateness kept going up and up and up, and finally, in despair, the director of the daycare center discontinued the fines. And now what do you think happened to lateness? Got even higher, because now it was a better deal. Here's the important thing to know. Now, could you have come up with a fine that would have worked? Of course. 10 years in prison for coming 10 minutes late, that would probably get people that would focus the mind. But reasonable penalties didn't work. And here was the logic behind the imposition of penalties. People already have one reason to come on time. They have an obligation. They have a responsibility, a moral and social responsibility. Let's give them that apparently isn't strong enough. Let's give them a second reason. Now it'll cost them. 2 reasons to do something have to be stronger than 1. Yes? Well, no, because what happens is that the second reason completely undermines the first. Coming on time loses any moral content at all. It is simply a matter of cost-benefit calculation. And then, once that seems to have happened, it looks like it permanently eliminates the social and moral sanctions on showing up on time to pick up your kid, because when you eliminate the fines, it's not like your sense of obligation perks back up. It seems like you have transformed parental behavior and the motivation behind it so that it has become now just about what's in my best interest. What am I willing to pay? And that's a disaster. Big tests in schools have I won't talk about nuclear waste dumps because I don't have enough time. It's basically the same story. Well, I will. I can do it in 2 sentences. You ask people in Switzerland if they'd be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in their community. 50% of people say yes. I assume the United States would get the same response. You ask people if they'd be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in their community if you paid them 6 weeks' salary a year. Now 25% of people say yes. No pay, 50%. Substantial pay, 25%. Why? Because you have implicitly instructed people to think about this as a matter of self-interest. rather than as a matter of citizen responsibility. And when they're thinking about it as a matter of self-interest, it is self-evidently true to them that it is not in their interest to have a nuclear waste dump in their community, no matter what they get paid. Bonuses in the financial sector. 30 years ago, smart economists, that's not an oxymoron, smart economists had this idea that the way to get companies performing well is to give leaders of companies a significant portion of their compensation in the form of stock options and bonuses. Now, when you get to the pinnacle of Google or IBM or GE, you won't sort of sit back, semi-retire, and have 4-hour lunches, because how much you earn is going to depend on how well the company does. And when this, it seems blindingly obvious now, since that's the way everybody gets paid, but it was an insight then, and it was an insight that inspired confidence that the market was now going to be completely self-regulated. You were making it so that people could only do well by doing good things for their companies. A revolution in engineering workplace organization. It is exactly that revolution that produced the concern for how well a company is doing quarter by quarter, or month by month, or week by week, or even minute by minute, so that CEOs consistently made decisions that sold the long-term well-being of their companies down the river in return for profitable quarters. This financial revolution turned out to bring in its wake a financial disaster. So here are just some examples of what happens when you demoralize the workplace. Now, you might think that there's no such thing as a banker who wants to do the right thing. Yeah, doctors want to do the right thing. Doctors want to cure disease and ease suffering. Teachers want to stimulate young minds. Lawyers want to pursue justice. But what the hell do bankers want to do except get rich? Well, it turns out even bankers, at least historically, while certainly interested in doing well for themselves, also saw themselves as performing a vital function for their communities. They were revered members of their communities. They enabled people to buy houses. They enabled people to start businesses or expand businesses. They were deeply respected. They wanted a profit, but they wanted a reasonable profit, and they earned the respect of their communities. You can still find bankers like this, but they tend to work in very small banks, banks that are community banks. They get up every day knowing that at the end of the day, somebody's life will have been made better. It's not clear to me that any of the bankers we read about on a daily basis these days in the financial pages think that there is any point at all to banking except for maximizing return on investment. And that just doesn't cut it. Okay, so too many rules undermines the development of the skill that you need to be wise, and too much reliance on incentives undermines the will that you need to be wise. And again, all of these efforts to reform systems were well-intentioned. They were not designed to make the systems worse. They were designed to make the systems better. And they may make the systems better in the short run, but they create a problem which guarantees that the systems will be worse in the long run. So, what about wise Googlers? So, don't be evil is just not enough. It's better to have that watchword than not to have it. I agree. But all that does is tell you what not to do. And it's sometimes useful to have negative instructions, know what pitfalls to avoid. But the question is, what should you be doing? What is it that Google can do or that you can do that actually improves the quality of life of individuals and the quality of life in a whole society? This is an extremely important question that should always be at the forefront of your minds. Focus on the user. What does your user want? And more important, from my point of view, what does your user need? Give people what they need, even if they don't necessarily know that that's what they need. This requires the kind of empathy that I was talking about a few minutes ago. You can't figure out what people need unless you understand them, and you can't understand them unless you know them. One thing, as an aside, that I'll suggest is that focus groups are almost remarkable in how useless they are, no matter what you're trying to study, because focus groups assume that people can tell you what's wrong and what's right, and in general, people can't tell you what's wrong and what's right. They don't understand themselves well enough to be helpful, even if they're trying to be. You have to watch what people do and not so much what people say. Keep an eye always on developing technology that is values-driven. Keep an eye always on what the telos, what the goal, what the purpose of the organization is. That needs always to be in mind. And what's important here is that it needs to be embodied in the day-to-day practices of the people who are actually doing the work. You know, these great speeches that CEOs make about how they're interested in serving the community are received with complete cynicism by their workforces, who know that they're going to be expected to make margins quarter by quarter in their area. And the CEO isn't going to give a damn how those margins get made as long as they get made. So the trick is to make sure that the telos of the organization, the mission of the organization, is actually embodied in the day-to-day practices of the organization. And lastly, fail early and often. I gather this is not foreign to people who work at Google. There's an enormous benefit to failure. Trial and error and mentoring by people who have already failed early and often are, as far as I know, the only route to wise decisions and wise practices. And so you need a culture in which people are encouraged to fail, with, I should point out, somebody looking over their shoulder to make sure that none of these failures are completely catastrophic. I don't think surgical residents should be given the freedom to fail when they start doing open heart surgery. You want to make sure that the patients don't die en route to their becoming skilled surgeons. The last point I'll make is that I think that if we refocus ourselves on the importance of wisdom, it can become self-sustaining. Once we are clued into why wisdom is important to get us the schools, the hospitals, the technology companies that we want and need, it will keep itself going. And here's why. What we know about happiness and its determinants is that there are two most important determinants of happiness. The two most important determinants of well-being are close connections to other people, a network of meaningful and close social relations, and meaning and purpose in your daily work. Freud had it right, though for the wrong reasons, when he said that life is all about love and work. Life is pretty much all about love and work. And what Ken Sharp and I believe is that you can't have good, meaningful, close relations to other people, and you can't do meaningful, purpose-driven work unless you have developed the practical wisdom that enables you to figure out what people need and then how to provide it. So once people become wise, their work goes better, their relationships go better, they get more and more eager to get up in the morning and do tomorrow more or less what they've done today, and that makes it self-sustaining. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for this wonderful talk. Was just thinking about a talk that Jared Diamond gave, I think in 2003 or 2004.
Who? I missed the name?
Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and
Yep.
Steel, and about the signs that this our civilization is headed toward collapse based on historical evidence of how. And I'm wondering if you look at the power structures that have prevented, that kind of suppress this kind of wisdom, that create all of these rules, do you think it's possible that that changes can come about within these power structures, or only after they collapse can wisdom become the way a society is run?
So it's a great question. I wish I knew with confidence the answer. What I can say is in the book we talk at some length about two kinds of people who work within these systems and acknowledge in their own terms, not in ours, that they're not working. We talk about people who are canny outlaws. They follow the rules because there's somebody looking over their shoulders, but they find ways to, like teachers, will follow the scripted curriculum, but they'll do it at double time. And so they squirrel away 10 minutes here and 20 minutes there and a half hour there, and in that time that they have saved, they teach the stuff the way they think it should be taught. They prep kids to take the standardized tests, and they'll tell them, listen, but if you get a question about this, don't give the answer I just told you, because you'll be marked wrong. Give this answer instead. So these are people who are trying to do it alone, and my view is that this is not sustainable. Eventually they burn out in discouragement, or they get caught and they get fired. More hopeful are people we call system changers. These are people working within the practice of law, the practice of medicine, who see that they are not training their new doctors and lawyers well and are trying to create systems for training, medical training, that are completely different from the ones that they grew up with. And some of these things are popping up in highly prestigious places as pilot programs. Harvard has one, UCSF has one. Students get contact with patients early. They see the same small set of patients for a whole year so that they actually get to understand what it means to be sick in the context of living an often complex and difficult life. They have lots and lots of interaction with mentors who are looking over their shoulders, letting them make the first pass at a decision, but correcting them when they get it wrong. The students in these programs love them. They're incredibly difficult to get into, like everybody wants to be in this program, but they only accommodate 15 or 20 people. Now, my hope is that what will happen over time when the evidence comes in that the people who get trained in this way become better lawyers, teachers, and so on, is that it will transform the way in which medical and legal education occur. That's a big step, but it's not enough. Because if they then enter the structure of their profession and all of the incentives that are presently in place continue to be in place, it seems to me it's almost certainly going to happen that all of the good stuff that they've learned gets destroyed, or at least tackled, challenged. So I hope you don't need the systems to collapse completely so that you can build new ones on the ruins. I'm hoping that it's possible to build new systems on not quite ruined, but clearly defective existing ones. But I don't know. I just don't know. There's an ideological component to this. Everyone thinks that the way to get what you want is to make it worth people's while. That's wrong. Doctors when people enter medical school wanting to be doctors for the right reason. Everyone? No. Almost everyone. Yes. You don't need to make it worth their while. You need to get out of their damn way so that they can do it the right way for the right reason on their own. And as long as we're wedded to this ideology that comes from economics, that nobody ever does anything except for some self-interested outcome, we'll never redesign systems in the way that we need to. So optimistic I'm not, but I'm also not hopeless.
Have you looked at the differences between the U.S. and other countries with respect to this practical wisdom topic?
The answer to that is no. We haven't really done the kind of careful and systematic inquiry. What we have done is look at examples, books and articles written about either the actual practice of teaching in medicine or the way in which teachers and doctors are trained, and use these examples to illustrate, we think often vividly, what's the wrong way and what's the right way to engage in these practices. But we haven't done anything remotely like counting. The sense I get is that the problem is less acute in Europe than it is in the United States, partly because one principal driver of all this obsession with rules is the threat of being sued. And that's less of an issue. The culture of litigiousness that is characteristic of the United States is close to unique to the United States. So there's a little bit more room in Europe for people to spread their wings and take a chance without worrying that the world will come crashing down around them. But I think the ideology that you have to make it worth people's while to get them to do anything is pretty much as pervasive there as it is in the U.S., and that's a major obstacle that needs to be overcome.
Hi, Professor Schwartz. I was actually in your practical wisdom seminar when you taught it with
Ken?
Yeah,
Who are you?
Misha.
Ah!
Yeah,
So this is were you in the first
I was
time?
in the first one. Yeah, yeah. So it's awesome to see that the.
Did I get it
book
right?
Yeah. I remember you walking through all the different industries, lawyers, and doctors, and pointing all that out. So I'm looking forward to looking at the book.
Thanks.
A question I had was about opting people in automatically. Going back to that.
Yep.
I think Google does a lot of this. We opt people into advertising on ad networks that they don't know about, hopefully in their best interest. Privacy issues as well. How does paternalism and practical wisdom help us walk that line in those areas particularly? Yeah.
This is an incredibly interesting and complicated question. I'll give you a brief pass at it. Sunstein and Thaler, when they wrote their book called Nudge, were very insistent, and I think it must be because Thaler is an economist, that you don't nudge people in a direction because it's good for society or even because it's good for them. You nudge them only when you have independent evidence that it's what they want. So if you didn't know that 96% of Americans approved of organ donation, it'd be hard to justify moving to an opt-out system of organ donation. That seems to me to be way too cautious. So I think it's appropriate to nudge people in directions that are good for them, whether they want it or not, or that are good for society. The critical thing is that you are not forcing people. People can opt out. If they don't opt out, what they end up getting and what they end up doing makes them better off and all the rest of us better off. But what exactly is the level of privacy, for example, that's the right level of privacy to serve the interests of individuals and the interests of the collective? That's a really, really hard question to answer, but I think it's one that's worth asking because defaults have incredible, Facebook is a classic example of the power of defaults. People didn't realize that they were parading all of their weapons and their body parts for the entire world to see. They just thought that their closest 12 to 15,000 friends would know about their unusual habits and hobbies. But it turns out, no, everybody, including anyone who might employ them, got to find out about that. It wasn't deliberate on the part of the people who did this. It was the default. So there are some defaults that are better than others, and it takes a lot of work and understanding of people to figure out which defaults are the right ones. The other thing I'll say is this. It is absolutely crucial, in my mind, that Google's integrity be unimpeachable, so that when people see the ranking of hits when they type in a search term, they know that there is no pecuniary interest driving that hierarchy. It is instead the result of a very smart algorithm that will only get smarter and that is designed to serve what the client's needs are. That's a very precious resource to guard and nurture, because once you lose that sense on the part of the public that you're in it for the public's good, it'll take you a generation to recapture it. My own concern is that Google has gotten a little bit careless about preserving the unimpeachability of its integrity in the service of a business model that obviously pushes in a different direction. So I don't think you can put a price on that. I think its value is essentially infinite, and it is something that is really easy to lose and then hard to recapture. That help?
So I have one other question that came to mind, which is both for me and for a coworker of mine, about rewards for children, for trying to get children to follow, for example, using the toilet and not in diapers. A coworker of mine gives his son chocolate chips, and his wife says it's terrible. You should never do that. That means they'll always be looking for a reward. Any thoughts on that?
This is why there's nothing in life that requires more wisdom than being a parent. It is terrible to use rewards to get your kid toilet trained unless you're desperate and nothing else works. It's terrible to use rewards to get kids to do their homework unless you're desperate and nothing else works. A lot of the seemingly, from my point of view, foolish efforts to incentivize school performance that school systems are now using, this is not the first thing they rush to. They rush to it basically in desperation. If there was some other way to do it, they couldn't figure out what that was, or they didn't have the resources. So they're going to try to improve the quality of the amount that kids learn any damn way they can. And I think sometimes parents are desperate enough that they do what they know in some sense is the wrong thing, because the goal is important enough that you just have to get it. And then you'll worry about the negative consequences of getting it in the wrong way further down the road. So, again, I don't know. You shouldn't. Some rewards are worse than others. Chocolate chips are worse than praise, for example. There is some reason to think that recognition is a less tainting reward than material rewards are. But even recognition is problematic because kids start doing work in school because they want to be recognized, not because they want to learn. So they're interested in approval and not mastery. And as the work gets harder, you see dramatic differences. Kids who are interested in approval choose easy things to work on so that they'll get approval. Kids who are interested in mastery are eager to fail, so they'll get smarter. Carol Dweck at Stanford has done brilliant research for 25 years on this distinction and how at roughly 3rd or 4th grade, kids who are performing at exactly the same level start to diverge. The mastery-oriented ones take off and the performance-oriented ones basically flatline. So a little too much recognition and praise may have the effect of turning your kid into somebody who always wants a pat on the head with unfortunate consequences down the road. But there's no formula. There just isn't a formula for being a parent, a friend, a doctor, or anything. We good? Thank you all. Thanks very much.